From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to this week's Middle East Focus. Turkey is 1 month into its military offensive against U.S.-backed Syrian Kurdish forces in the area of Afrin in northwest Syria. The operation launched by Turkey, called Operation Olive Branch, was launched exactly 1 week after the U.S. said it would create a Kurdish-led 30,000-strong force along the Syrian-Turkish border. The Syrian Democratic Forces, a predominantly Kurdish force, was Washington's main partner in the fight against ISIS. But Turkey considers the Syrian Kurdish militia a terrorist organization and fears an autonomous Kurdish region on its border. Tensions have worsened over the Afrin operation, and there are threats to the town of Manbij further east. Secretary Rex Tillerson, U.S. Secretary Tillerson, was just in Turkey attempting to mend U.S. Turkish relations. How is the Turkish operation going? How has it altered the status quo in northern Syria? How has it affected the U.S. Turkish relationship? With me to discuss these and related questions are Gonul Tol, MEI's director of our Turkish program, and Amberin Zaman, a Turkish analyst and journalist based here in D.C., and a columnist for Al Monitor, working on Turkish and Kurdish issues. Gonul, let me start with you. What has Turkey been trying to achieve in Operation Olive Branch, and how's it going?
Well, militarily, the aim has been unclear. Initially, when Turkey launched the operation, Turkish officials said that the operation would end when the last YPG fighter is dead. But that hasn't been... Yes. And that hasn't been happening. Basically, Turkey, it's become a push into villages around Afrin. So to kill the last YPG fighter, you need a major operation into Afrin city center, but that hasn't happened. So militarily, it's not clear. I think the aim is encircling Afrin, which is possible, but I think politically, the aim has been for Erdogan to galvanize the nationalist voters at home.
And how has it been reverberating inside Turkey politically?
More than 80% of Turkish population is supporting the offensive, and according to public opinion polls conducted recently, the AKP increased its votes by 4 or 5 points after the Afrin operation.
Just after the operation.
Yeah, so that's a major win for Erdogan.
Amberin, you also follow Kurdish affairs very well. How has the YPG dealt with this? Was it a big surprise that this happened? They've also apparently reached out to the Assad regime. What are they thinking?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a surprise for them because Erdogan's been threatening for a long while now to go after Afrin and after Manbij, as you mentioned in your introduction. They're obviously very unhappy with what's going on, and it means that they're having to redeploy fighters away from Deir ez-Zor, where they're fighting alongside the US-led coalition against ISIS, and sort of beefing up their presence in Afrin, and doing so with the help, or the rather reluctant help, shall we say, of the Assad regime and their allied militias, because they have to cross through territory held by those groups in order to get to Afrin.
And how has that been going? Has there been cooperation? There's also been reports of Syrian allied forces deploying into Afrin.
Well, here's the thing. When the Turks sort of made it clear that they were going to go in, and we saw the Russian peacekeepers, monitors moving away from the areas that the Turks were going to move into, of course, it became very clear that this operation was happening. And so the YPG reached out to the regime, and the regime said, well, we'll only help you if you hand over full control of Afrin and various areas around the city itself. And the YPG said, well, no, we won't. So initially, the relationship was very bad on that particular issue. But then over time, as you said, they seem to be talking again and coming to some kind of agreement, perhaps. But it's terribly complicated because the Russians are not happy with that at all.
And we'll get to the Russians in a minute, but Gonul, let's talk about Secretary Tillerson and his visit to Ankara. Give us a bit of context. U.S. Turkish relations have been deteriorating for a while, and then this latest development made it even worse. What was Secretary Tillerson trying to do? Did he achieve anything?
Well, I think he was trying to mend fences, and he went to Turkey, well, especially after Turkey threatened an operation on Manbij. Of course, the tension between the two countries got worse. So I think the aim of Tillerson was to mend fences with Turkey, but I don't think they agreed on the main issues. I think Tillerson reportedly made 3 offers. One is establishing a safe zone in Afrin, and second
What
is...
would that, whose safe zone? Who would manage it?
See, that is the question, and it's unclear because Afrin, the U.S. has nothing to offer in Afrin because it's a Russian zone. Russia controls the skies and the area, so it's not clear to me what the U.S. can offer in Afrin. And I think the second offer that Tillerson made to Turks was that there could be a joint military patrol in Manbij, so Turkish and American forces could patrol Manbij area.
So just to clarify to our listeners, so Manbij is a town east of this area of Afrin that we're talking about, that's sort of on the eastern, it's west of the Euphrates, but on the eastern side of
Yes.
the region we're talking about, and it's currently controlled by YPG forces backed by the U.S. It's outside of the region of fighting today.
Yes, and also I think Tillerson promised the Turks that they will gradually cut ties with the YPG. So we don't know how the Turks reacted to those offers, but Turkey has long demanded disbanding Manbij Military Council, and the YPG, pro-YPG forces are dominant in the Manbij Military Council. I don't think the U.S. would agree to that. So I think what this visit has achieved is it has averted what many thought an imminent Turkish attack on Manbij. But still, the YPG issue might be the most pressing of disagreements between the countries, but it's not by any means the only issue. So I think it's difficult to normalize relations.
Did General Mattis visit recently, and did he come out with any other sort of results?
Well, he had held talks, but McMaster, right before Tillerson, McMaster was in Turkey.
General McMaster.
Yeah, General McMaster was in
yeah.
Turkey before Tillerson. So again, I think it's at this point unclear what they agreed on. They, I think, delayed the negotiations further. They agreed to establish a mechanism to talk about these different issues in March. So this was in a way delayed that breaking point that could have happened if Turkey went ahead with the Manbij operation, but I think it's unlikely to resolve the pressing issues, especially with regard to U.S. YPG cooperation.
Thank you, Gonul. Amberin, you had mentioned the Russian, position on all of this. Russia seemed to have agreed with Turkey on this operation. Would that be an accurate way to describe it? Where do they stand today with Turkey or with the YPG on all these developments?
Well, it's actually a very interesting dynamic because obviously without Russia's consent, Turkey could not have launched that operation because, as Gonul said, they control the skies over Afrin. And why did they agree to that? I think what's really happened here is with Tillerson coming out and saying that the United States was not going to leave Syria anytime soon, that they were in there for the long haul, not just to stabilize post-ISIS, but also to counter Iran and to squeeze Assad out of power, if not necessarily, changing the regime per se. I think that set off alarm bells, not just in Ankara, but in Moscow, Tehran, and obviously in Damascus too. And I think the Russians were very angry. They want the Americans out, and they've been putting a lot of pressure on the YPG recently to sort of dial down its relationship with the Americans. So I think all of that sort of fed into Russia's decision to let the Turks go in. But then there's this parallel Idlib process that we might want to talk about later. But just to get back to your question about Mattis, the day before Tillerson met with Erdogan in Ankara, Mattis met with his Turkish counterpart in Brussels and apparently made a rather odd offer, which was to get the YPG to fight the PKK. Which,
What?
yes. And the PKK, as you know, birthed the YPG. They're pretty much the same. I call them the branches of the same tree. So obviously a lot of confusion in American thinking. Tillerson saying we're staying on, and their partner there is the YPG, obviously, but then going to Ankara and saying, we're going to end this relationship. So a very, very confused policy, I would say.
Well, I do want to get to Idlib in a minute, but staying with Afrin for a little bit, is the operation bogging down? Are there any sort of, points in the near future where it might be resolved or an agreement might be reached, or is this going to go on somewhat indefinitely?
Well, I think it all depends on what Russia and the regime and Iranian-backed forces will do. As you said earlier, pro-regime forces are now in Afrin, and I think that might, at some point, Turkey will be forced to withdraw. It's extremely difficult for Turkish forces to have a long-term presence in Afrin. And we now know that, and I think that was the Russian plan all along. Russia or the regime, or neither Iran, they will not tolerate a long-term Turkish presence. So at some point, I think Turkey and Turkey-backed forces will have to hand over whatever they captured to regime forces.
Was that offered earlier by anybody, that let the regime come in, and did the YPG reject that?
Yes, well, earlier, right before Turkey launched the military incursion, Russia led the talks between the regime and the YPG. So the YPG forces were told, if you want to prevent a Turkish military incursion, you can allow regime forces in Afrin, and the YPG refused. And that's when Russia gave the green light to Turkish military operation.
So now that's happening anyway, but after the operation.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Amberin, still before moving on, and you mentioned that a number of fighters have been drawn away from the Raqqa area, from Deir ez-Zor, to join the fight in Afrin. Has that been a major shift? Has that affected sort of security and developments in other parts of Syria?
I would say that in addition to Turkey's very real concern about the YPG along its borders, domestic political concerns, as Gonul pointed out, with Erdogan wanting to shore up his nationalist base through this operation and obviously succeeding, I think Turkey also pretty much wanted to kneecap the United States by doing this operation because, as I said, it's distracting from the fight against ISIS, and more fighters are coming into Afrin away from that area, and the United States obviously is very worried about that. And imagine if on top of that Turkey opened a second front in Manbij, that would have been a disaster.
And it's also pushing the Kurds towards the regime.
Exactly.
Which the U.S.,
well
at least in the West.
Well,
what do you think? I mean, is that a general shift or just...
Here's the rub. I mean, there are quite a few people, certainly people who are very influential in Syria policy here in Washington, in the administration, who actually think that in the medium to long term, the Kurds do have to make a deal with the regime. And the way they sort of see that is with the Russians actually playing the guarantor role. So, in fact, the notion that the United States is unhappy with the Kurds doing business with the regime, I think, is slightly misleading. And indeed, I've heard from my own YPG sources that the Americans were quite eager, in fact, for them to make some kind of arrangement with the regime in Afrin, because they hope that if that happens, then the YPG can go back to the real business of fighting ISIS back in the rest of Syria, in the northeastern part where the American troops are present.
Thank you, Amberin. Let's go to Idlib. You mentioned Idlib, Amberin. That's maybe I don't want to say the last big battle remaining, but it is, a stronghold certainly of some of the Al-Qaeda-related groups. A lot of people have been displaced into the Idlib region. There's reportedly about maybe 2.5 million people there. Tell us a bit, what do you see down the road happening in Idlib, whether it's from the regime side or from other forces?
Well, it's a very complicated situation down there as well. And as you know, the hope among the Russians certainly was that Turkey would somehow find a way of splitting away the so-called more moderate factions from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and sort of isolate the hardliners, allowing in turn the regime and the Russians perhaps to go after them. But things haven't quite shaken out that way. And I think increasingly it's becoming obvious to all the stakeholders that Turkey's influence over HTS isn't as big as people presumed. So Turkey has, as you know, deployed more troops in this so-called de-escalation zone, pushing further south, because initially the Russians were very grumpy about the fact that the Turks hadn't deployed as
Russians
many
are often grumpy.
troops as they said they would, and were instead sort of focusing on the YPG. But now I think, and certainly after Russia briefly sealed the airspace just in the middle of this Operation Olive Branch, I think the Turks kind of got with the program, and then proceeded to deploy more troops, but then ran into resistance from the regime and their Iranian-backed allies. Why? Because Iran and the regime, as Gonul pointed out, really don't want the Turks there at all, because they know that once the Turks come in, they usually don't leave. We've seen that in Cyprus. We've seen that in Iraqi Kurdistan, where you have 2,000 plus Turkish troops, and now Iraq, of course, is trying to get them out of Bashika near Mosul. So they tend to stay.
Who are the Syrian fighters that are fighting in the Manbij area with the Turks? Were some of those drawn away from Idlib, some of the Arab fighters? Gonul, do you know who that might be? I mean, there are some of the...
Within the Manbij Military Council?
No, in the Afrin operation, Turkey has also called on some Syrian Arab fighters that are fighting there as well, that they drew them out of some of the areas in Idlib. I was wondering if you had any...
Well, I think it's a strange mix. I remember reading these the reports from Turkish media that there are jihadi factions, and, Erdogan called them a truly national army, and Turkish opposition was questioning.
I believe some of those came from the Idlib area. I'm not sure exactly who, but they pulled some people from there to fight in
Well, there's also this accusation that some of them are former ISIS fighters. I mean, it's impossible to establish precisely who they are without actually being on the ground. But I would say it's equally sort of unfair, I'd say, almost to, caricaturize all of these fighters, lump them together and just label them sort of bloodthirsty jihadis out to chop everybody's heads.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, there's still some people who really started out fighting because they wanted to bring democracy to Syria,
or
make it a
of some
better
kind.
place.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be careful about sort of
Lumping
attaching
them all
labels.
together.
But it is also undermining, those Arab factions that joined Turkey's Afrin operation, by doing so, they're undermining their own cause. Because again, I think at the end of, I don't know what the end game there is, but I think the territories capture will be handed over to the regime. So that puts these Arab fighters within the Free Syrian Army in a very awkward position.
Definitely. And Gonul, finally, any last thoughts about sort of what Turkey's next moves might be in the Syrian arena, whether it relates to talks in Astana or further operations relating to Idlib? We heard Amberin's views on the Idlib situation. Do you have anything you want to conclude with before we...
Well, it's really difficult because, again, I don't think it's up to the Turks. Now it's very much it will be shaped by Russia and what the regime and the Iranian-backed forces are doing. In Idlib, I think it was part of the deal. Turkey has been establishing more observation points after it launched the operation in Afrin. And I think that was one of the preconditions of Russia. So Turkey is doing more in that regard. But in terms of Afrin, I think it depends on whether there's a deal reached between the YPG and the regime. We don't know if there are conflicting reports on that. But if there's a deal, then again, I think Turkey and Turkey-backed forces might end
up leaving, as you said. Interesting. Okay, well, sadly, there's always too much going on in the very conflicted Syrian arena. Now much of it related to regional powers and global powers like the U.S. and Russia. I want to thank you, Amberin Zaman, for being with us today. And thank you, Gonul, for joining us on this podcast. Before concluding, to our listeners, just a quick announcement that enrollments are open for MEI's language classes. We give classes in Arabic, Farsi, Hebrew, Turkish, and you can get more information about it at www.mei.edu/languages. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.